July 24th, 2018. The agenda is as follows. First thing on the agenda, we'll look for the approval of the minutes, meeting minutes, from July 16th, 2018.
So moved.
Thanks, Rod. We got a second?
I'll second that.
Okay,
Mr. Chair.
any discussion on that? Hearing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Pull same sign. That's approved. Item number 2, we're going to defer to a later date until we can.
Later time.
Later time,
Yes.
excuse me, until we can have somebody else join that conversation. And so we'll go to item number 3, work session discussion points. Amy.
Thank you, President, Commissioners. So to start the discussion, just wanted to bring forward with the Port Authority Treasurer, Son Moore, the 2019 proposed Port Authority levy and budget review. And I will turn it over to Bill to provide more information, but just as a high level, according to state statute, as was outlined in your memo in the packet, that a city, at the request of a Port Authority, can levy a tax in a year to the benefit of the Port Authority, and we have done that in prior years. The tax cannot exceed 0.01813% of the estimated market value of the year. The maximum levy that we could look at in Fergus Falls for the Port Authority would be $165,592. We are proposing an $85,000 levy, which is a $10,000 increase over this current year's levy of $75,000. So just a high level of the numbers, so you can reference those. Included in the packet at your chairs is the memo from Bill Sonmore, as well as the proposed budget. And we're not looking to take an action on this tonight. It would be to a recommendation to move to the next step of the budget process, but just wanted to walk through it with you at this time.
Thank you, Amy. She summarized that really pretty well. That's the big picture of it. As far as we've been levying $75,000 for the last couple of years for the Port Authority, funding the Port Authority operations, and we were also paying off some industrial park property. So that's some of the past of what we were using those funds for, why we were levying that. The industrial park property is paid off, so going forward, we'll maybe be able to build a little bit more cash balance now with this as well. You have your budget document in front of you as well. You can, like Amy said, we're proposing moving that from $75,000 to $85,000. And really that comes from moving some expenses that have been under the EIC. If you recall, the EIC was fully funded from the City of Fergus Falls through our general fund. And a few expenses for some memberships, and Amy can tell you more about them, but the Economic Development Association of Minnesota, Community Venture Network being one of the larger ones, and Amy, what's the GMNP?
Greater Minnesota Partnership.
Thank you. I don't know the acronyms quite so well. So that's why we're increasing that this year, is moving those over. They were previously covered by the EIC, but with the changes there, I'm looking at having those changes or covered somewhere, Port Authority being a logical choice for that. Other revenue items within the budget, you can see we do budget for some interest earnings there. A lot of that goes to the CBH facility because we're accumulating funds within the port for capital maintenance on that building that the port owns, but the state leases and the state provides the funding. So within the rents, we have rent from the state of Minnesota makes up the bulk of that. We did decrease the rents as well, as we're looking at having a sale of property later this fall from the Norgren property. So of course we'll receive less rent then accordingly with that. So that's been reflected. Under the expense side of things, we are moving part of the Port Authority Director's time into this. In 2018, all of Amy's time was included within the general fund budget. We're just doing a lateral move. It's same dollars, just allocating them out between two places now, Port Authority and the general fund. And of course we budget for Jill under that area as well. And she's budgeted in some of the city funds as well too, so a portion to the port. We are decreasing 57,000 under land, you will see. We were looking at using a TIF district, some leftover funds from there, amended that district for property abatement issues is what they would be used for qualified housing projects. And subsequent to that all being done, the state auditors have a separate opinion on that, so which changes the game. We can no longer use those funds for that. We can use the funds up to a certain point, maybe around $40,000 to $50,000 that we will maintain in that TIF fund, but we're probably going to decertify that district, and you'll see that come before the City Council at a future meeting. But we'll keep as much of the funds as we can for qualified housing projects. So that's a change. CBHH facility, that's all the operations out at that facility. We've talked about that in the past. Fully funded by the state of Minnesota, and we do a true-up with them each year, so they make sure the Port Authority is made whole, so the port isn't putting any dollars into that facility. The last section of the budget was used for support for the EIC, and since that organization is changing, we'll no longer have any expenses there as well. So it's a very brief overview of the budget. At the end of 2017, I estimated, we had $30-some thousand in the Port Authority that was remaining, separate from that CBHH. Looking at that potentially growing to around 80,000 in 2018, and then if we continue on this track, looking at growing that another 20,000 by the end of 19 to about 102,000. So you can see the goal is trying to get some traction so we have some funds to work with in the Port Authority as well. Brings us back to that slide that you do have the legal authority to levy up to $165,000. So that would be another $80,000 with what we are. But of course, keeping in mind that would be another $80,000 levy. So we'd have to balance that with what happens through the tax levy committee, and of course this Port Authority levy comes in through that tax levy committee as well and gets part of that whole process. I'll probably stop there so I don't take too much of our short time, but if you have any questions, again, we're not acting on this tonight, but before we approve the city budget, we'll want the Port Authority to act on that levy. So it gives you some time to digest it, and we can do it at our next Port Authority meeting.
Thanks, Bill.
You bet.
Can I ask a quick question, Bill? Sorry.
Sure.
So of that $75,000 per year, would you say we're paying off, we're paying off some land, which is the industrial park?
That's true.
But how much of that, what was the payment, what was the annual payment?
We, let me look. So in 2017, we paid off that industrial park. That was $149,000, so $150,000 was our final payment. We were making like $30,000 annual payments on that industrial park property with a little bit more of a balloon at the end. So we were preparing for that, and that's why we started levying this $75,000 a few years back, because we saw that coming and make sure you had the funds there to pay off that land, which we did, and that was done at the end of last year.
Okay,
So,
thanks.
you bet. Rod?
Yeah, when we look at these overall use of the Port Authority, is it within the Port Authority powers and whatever to have money that is used for seeking grants that would benefit,
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I can take that. Commissioner Speed, I'll get into the next items I'll be talking about are some
You
of
can
those
answer it,
duties
yeah,
and
later if
powers.
you want,
So
but
we
yeah.
can talk about that and some
Sure.
recommendations. But the short answer is yes.
Anything else before I turn it back over?
I think
All
we're
right.
good. Thanks, Bill.
You bet.
And then we'll look at item 3B, Port Authority legislative authorities and powers.
Sure, so again, just wanted to provide a very high overview of port authorities themselves. So state legislature authorizes the individual creation of port authorities within communities. There's about 25 port authorities across the state. They are a separate unit of government, so that's always important to keep in mind that, here, we'll talk about composition of the commissioners in a bit, but in many communities, they're not the same as the city council, and thinking about them as two separate bodies is important. Fergus Falls itself was authorized as a port authority in the late 1980s. A key distinction of why communities want to have a port authority and why it's valuable is that opportunity to issue those general obligation bonds without a referendum or an election, which is unlike economic development authorities or housing and redevelopment authorities. So that's a key distinction. Some of the others, authorities and powers are the same, but that is a key difference to note, and a powerful piece to have available. So within this, the Chapter 469, the state statute that outlines port authorities and economic development authorities as well as HRAs, there are specific examples of duties and powers of what the port authorities can do. Basics, these are just some basic examples. Some are looking at bridges and tunnels and things that you might suspect more associated with ports, which we don't have an active port. But we certainly can and do buy and sell property. That's a primary piece. The public relations and memberships, we talked about a little bit of this already with the shifting of funding from the EIC. We'll be looking to the Port Authority to now step into that role to cover some of those memberships and connections to trade organizations, et cetera. Conduct surveys and create plans for supporting development, specifically industrial development. Applying for grants, being the granting agency, often for state grants. Port authorities are eligible entities to directly apply versus the city. Sometimes they do need to be the city, but often when they're development-related grants, they can be the Port Authority. And as that cash balance that Bill was referencing that we're trying to work towards building up, to have that cash available to have flexible ability to apply for those grants and have those matching monies or resources that are needed for the preparation of the grant themselves is a really important tool for the Port Authority to be able to look at that cash and have that flexible cash. It might not always be budgeted for. We don't know always what grant opportunities might be available in the coming year, as we just talked about a budget for 2019. It is hard to predict, or how projects will advance in the coming 6 to 9 months to know if we might be pursuing a grant opportunity. So the importance of having that available pool to have flexible dollars to support development and redevelopment is a key activity that the Port Authority should be thinking about. So other questions on duties? I kept it, again, pretty high level, but this kind of encompasses it. There's a whole chapter within the state statute talking about duties and powers. Like I said, the tunnels and bridges and some of the things that we don't get into, but those are, the real estate is a key piece of it.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's take that, extrapolate that a bit more in the Port Authority. As I understand it, it's a regional. It's not simply within the city limits in terms of its ability to study something or work with something. This is how I understand from the statutes.
Yeah.
And so my question then is, there's two areas that Fergus Falls in the future might need to explore. One of them is the gas availability that we have in Fergus Falls. We are at the end of a line, therefore gas is rationed, and people know this, farmers know this, to the west of us. So our gas would have to come in, I believe, from North Dakota, from east North Dakota through Wahpeton. So the point being, maybe we can clarify this sometime, but the Port Authority, conceivably, because it can be regional, could be involved in some way in trying to help fund a study or a group that could look at our economic possibilities and what it would take to bring gas in from the west, how it would collaborate with other groups, et cetera. Kind of a question like, okay, we can footnote, look at that. Second one relates to rail lines. I've talked to people about rail authorities in areas, and that usually typically involves like county people, it involves other groups, but that they involve studies and working on, okay, if we were to try and make sure our rail line remained viable, if we had a soybean processing facility that we could bring in, the Port Authority might be able to be involved in a study, that help to, you know, work on that from legislative and other examples. That's another footnote we can answer later. But I wanted to bring it up because I think people, that we all need to think about that port authorities have a larger role and can have a regional effect, and that, yeah, we operate within the city primarily, but that was something I wanted to clarify so we all understand our, you know, our duties as sitting on this Port Authority Board. So it's, yeah, I know you can't answer it all right now, but that's.
I was just making notes, but
Yeah.
certainly,
We'll
you know, even
clarify
just
it.
having Great Plains Natural Gas come in to provide a baseline of information on the availability, what are their future plans for access and provision of that utility. I think that would be a very good starting point to learn.
Right.
And then determine what further study would need to take place and what other partners would be appropriate to do that.
Yeah, and, you know, the third point that might just be noted, again, the availability of our internet service and our broadband, you know, economic development opportunities. Again, we are somewhat limited looking at the 10-year study in this area around Fergus Falls. A lot of the development is projected to go north of us. And so there's another question that would be something we might want to think about in the future if it benefited Fergus Falls, you know, and can we do something economically in that area as part of the study. So those three things we can clarify later, perhaps.
Sure. I think the broadband piece, the Otter Tail County has undertaken that study and again, could come and bring that update. That work had previously been updated and reported through the EIC, and so as this evolution takes place, we need to be cognizant of bringing those updates back to the Port Authority now, and
Right.
so that this knowledge is shared broadly with the Port Authority, and to know what work is happening, what work has already happened in relation, especially with broadband. The county has expended quite a bit of time and effort on studying that and looking at how to ensure that the entire county has that equitable access to high-speed internet for quality of life, economic development, and you know, just the expectation of residents that are here and that we hope to recruit to the area as well. So I think that we could certainly bring an update on the work that they're doing. They have a task force that's meeting now that the final report has been made to the county commissioners, and they recommended that task force be formed that's representative of the county and is working towards creating plans to get that access available for all.
Good information.
Thank you.
Any other thing as far as item number 2 to bring up, commissioners? Questions or discussions? Okay. Move on to item number C then.
All right, so commissioner composition, this has come up, you know, just wanted to bring this information for discussion. So again, back to that state statute, that port authorities will have 7 commissioners, which we do certainly, and 2 of whom at least must be city council members. In the case of Fergus Falls, all of those members are comprised of the city council. Remaining members, if they're not indicated as ours are, would be appointed by the mayor and approved by the city council. And as I mentioned, the Fergus Falls City Code indicates that all members of our Port Authority are members of the City Council, and there's a rotation of membership. So I contacted a number of other port authorities from across the state to get a feel for what other compositions are out there, and generally there was 2 primary areas. There was those who just had the 2 members of the City Council, and then the mayor would appoint the balance of those 5 members. There was one that had the mayor in addition to the 2 members. There were a couple that have all city council members, so we're not fully unique in that. But I would say the majority that I talked to, that I was able to research, do just have those 2 that are city council members, and the balance are appointed by the mayor, according, you know, kind of to that truest reading of the state statute, that 2 are members, the balance are appointed. And you know, if that, we'll have some other recommendations on that, but, so that's the background. It can be changed. It certainly is different in many other port authorities as far as composition. So I'll put that out for discussion by the commissioners.
So, Amy, in it says obviously the city code, is Where does that sit and how does that change? Or how can we change
The
it?
council would have to enact an ordinance saying something different.
Right.
Right now, it's set by law. The code says it shall be members of the city council, the composition. So that's the council would be the entity that would have to either repeal that or adopt something different. But it'd take an ordinance.
Has it always been that way, or when did it change and why did it change?
I think it's always been that way.
Okay.
So if, just a question.
Bless you.
If we, sorry.
No, go ahead. I was blessing him.
If we didn't have the city code, it would just, then we could put whoever, I mean, we could still have the 7. We don't need a city code if there's a state statute, correct?
Well, it depends if you want to make it mandatory that the members, who the members are. That's what the value of the city code is. If you said just wanted to repeal the city code and just rely upon the state statute,
You could still have 7.
You could still have 7,
Council
but you'd have to
members.
have at least 2.
Right.
Yeah, it would just allow you to do whatever.
Yeah.
And is 7 a maximum number?
Yes, 7,
Right.
that is the state code, maximum of 7, and that's why it isn't 9 or
Yeah.
8. Yeah, 7 is the maximum.
Yeah. Question on, just, and historically, that's a question I had. As I understand it, I know Lee Rogness and others were on this earlier, whether it was the 90s or late 80s. So to the question of, has it always been this way, all members shall be members of the city council, I don't believe it's always been that way.
I think it started.
It started-
Differently.
Huh?
I think it started differently.
It
like you
started
said.
differently, and so I just wanted to clarify that for the record, that we know that it hasn't always been this way.
Yes.
And that the statute must be followed in Minnesota, but the code, I believe, is since the 90s or something like that.
I can tell you.
And you can certainly, yeah, go back. But it had a different composition at one point.
I believe that, also that's true, and
Yeah.
City Attorney Nicomo can confirm that in the code itself.
So is there any discussion on this for, changes, or obviously it would be something coming through the council, but would we have any?
I think we should review it, and I think it would be good to not have it to be 100% city council members. Whether that's split 4 and 3, or but at least to get some different people on it, I think would be a positive thing. But if you had 4 city council members and 3 external, you still have, because at the end of the day, obviously, they do have the ability to levy the tax. So at least if there was 4 city council members, you're gonna have 3 external. Yeah, but at least it would be hopefully a robust discussion about the topic at the time.
I personally think that should be we shouldn't be all of us on here. It should be rotating, I think it'd be a good thing every year, rotate it out. It just makes it, to get the more public, different people in the public's eye, I think it'd be a lot better, and let the mayor appoint them, and
Yeah.
I think it'd be a great thing. So we should look at that probably before the end of the year.
Mhm.
Maybe
I
after
think,
agree.
I mean-
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, I just want to make one comment on the levy. It is the Port Authority can't,
through the council.
without the city council's approval, implement the levy. So
Right.
it still does
Right.
have to go back to city council, just to
Right.
clarify, whether the Port Authority approves a levy next month, it's still up to the city council whether they
Right.
want to actually implement that levy.
I don't
Is
I
that-
think-
we interpret it that way.
I think it might be that the Port Authority acts, the city has to levy it, so the city council levies it, but when I read the statute, the levy says the city shall
Back up,
levy.
That's new,
back
okay.
up a few slides,
Sorry.
and the
Yeah.
language that you
Right.
have is the city shall at the request.
Yep, the city shall.
Yeah.
At the request of the port. So it's definitely a 2-step. The
Yeah.
port initiates it, and then the city will levy it, but it still has to go through the city, and it gets certified with our city
Yeah.
levy.
Can you clarify that with the shall? Can we find out
Shall, I believe, means must.
Yeah,
So it's not really.
It's not
it's a separate
could,
authority.
but-
Excuse
But we'll
me,
research
yeah.
that. We
Yeah.
don't have to answer that
Yeah,
today.
we will-
but-
And before we come back in August for that actual
Yeah.
resolution for the levy, I can say when I've worked with economic development authorities, and they may be different than port authorities, the EDAs I've worked with often ask for more levy than what the city council actually authorized. So there may be distinction between port authorities, again, having that higher level of power. So we'll clarify that before the August action that we would
Yeah.
be looking
And the
at.
second line there, must not exceed.
93.
Right, yeah, that's
So that's
no
another-
question about that
Right,
number.
so
Yeah.
that's another stipulation there.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, it maxes out,
Yeah.
definitely, but.
Yeah.
So could we have,
So
excuse me, Chair.
I would
Just
say-
1993 was
Oh.
the clarification, I just wanted, for the minutes, if we could have that. 1993 was the date at which it was changed, because, I remember specifically because we had the industrial park area and the Port Authority was working on that area, and so there was a different composition at that time, before 1993. Thank you.
So just on this one then, do we need to ask staff to come back with a recommendation on
To the city council.
how we proceed to change the city code to be X, whether it's 4 and 3 or is that the city council that needs to do that?
City council, right, so a recommendation from the Port Authority to the city council to take that action.
Yep. And you're simply changing a sentence. The sentence is the commissioners shall be 7 in number and all shall be members of the council. So whatever you want that to
Yeah.
say, that would be the recommendation.
I mean, I would make the proposal that we change that line to say, well, this is, sorry.
Say that.
Just strike the
Shall be
language.
7 members, 2 of whom must be city
Yeah.
council members?
Yeah.
And if the mayor decides to appoint more than 2, I mean,
Well, it's ultimately the council's
Yeah.
approval, so.
So we adopt, so I'd make the recommendation that we adopt the state statute as written.
Language consistent
Yeah.
with the state statute.
Language is consistent with the state statute.
do we have a second on
Is that a
that?
motion?
Yes.
Yeah, I'll second that.
Other discussion?
That would be the recommendation to the
Recommendation
council.
to the council.
And would you also imply that the clarification between shall, is that must or is that?
That's a different subject matter.
We'll clarify it.
Okay.
That was the levy question.
Okay.
Well, that will
We'll
clarify.
work with Rolf over here, so.
Okay.
So could I have a point of clarification? If the Port Authority is asking that the statute be enacted for us as written, that we're requesting that to the council, does the shall language then apply, the same as if we say we would like to levy something on behalf of Fergus Falls, Greater Fergus Falls, under the Port Authority? So assuming that we establish that the Port Authority has a different authority than the city, like it, but we have that authority to levy something, doesn't it mean that the Port Authority sets its own, if we adopt that, if we say to the city council, this is what we're recommending, the city council approves that, they can't veto the Port Authorities if they're a separate power.
There are things, I know, for instance, when you're issuing bonds, there are certain things the port has to get the permission of the city. I know in the past we've had that, so
Sure.
there are gonna be things that,
On shared items.
yeah.
Well, we just need more clarification,
Yeah.
but I think it's a point that we should be very clear on, so we understand how we're acting on this, if we're actually recommending something that will be likely passed, or if it's a discussion item
Right.
for the council.
Well, I think we can get that answer before we vote as a city
Yeah,
council.
yeah.
But I think
But I wanna
it's
make
well
sure.
noted,
Yeah,
yeah.
so
So
staff,
there's
we'll
a-
have that answered before we discuss.
Right, but the motion on the table right now is to recommend to the city council to amend the commissioner composition, update the city code to be reflective of the state statute language.
Correct.
To be consistent with state statute.
Yeah,
That's the
and my.
motion right now.
Right, and I
Yeah.
seconded it, but my
Okay.
point of information was that we make sure that that recommendation is actually one that's allowed to be discussed by the council, that it isn't something the Port Authority can just say, we're asking you, like the shall language of a levy. I want to make sure that we understand that, and Rolf could answer that for us, or our attorney, right, Rolf? Before that discussion. I stand with the motion, I just want to have a point of clarification, so we know what we're doing.
Right.
For the code.
As a
This
council,
is just for the
yeah.
code language
Yeah.
update,
Right.
yes.
Okay, good discussion. Any other questions we have before we vote on this issue? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. That motion is carried. Item number D, Port Authority meeting dates.
All right, so this kind of gets to the discussion on,
And just real quickly,
Was Ken-
just to
he-
remind you of the time.
Was he calling you or is he available?
We're gonna work on that, but
Yep,
we're gonna probably have to make things move faster.
okay. All right, item number D, Port Authority meeting dates.
all right, so our current bylaws of the Port Authority indicate regular meetings to be held at 7 a.m. on the fourth Thursday of the month. And meetings can be called, though, with appropriate 3-day notice, as we did with this meeting. But I'm making a recommendation that they, like this one, not be held in conjunction with city council meetings because the two bodies being separate political bodies. And to provide that additional separation of the duties and roles, especially if the composition of the commissioners shifts. So just something to keep in mind. The don't need to make any determination, but just to be keeping that in mind, and maybe when a new composition comes forward, they make an amendment to the bylaws to reflect a different consistent meeting date. So.
I think that makes sense. Anybody have anything else on that? And at this point, we're gonna move to item number E. I think this was either Rod or Anthony, we discussed about getting updated on reports.
Oh, I had one more slide, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Some other considerations that, again, we don't need to dive into tonight, but again, just as we work to beef up the powers and the activity of the Port Authority, to look at how we can review and analyze our existing TIF districts. There's ways that I believe we can capture some revenue out of those districts to use more broadly for development purposes of existing districts. So not even contemplating new districts, but just how we can better manage those from a financial perspective. And typically we'd look for an advisor to provide that expertise. That leads into the second point of an RFP or RFQ for development finance proposals. Currently, we have Springstead as our municipal advisor. They don't cover our development or redevelopment activities. So whenever we have a piece, we are reaching out, but we don't have that consistent relationship with an advisor around that. Again, just food for thought as we continue these dialogues. And then developing a multi-organization economic development strategy. So making sure we have everyone in the room to lay out what is the strategy of our community and that we are all working together towards that goal in a thoughtful manner, and that we're working in a way that we can measure success and be able to do that incorporating all of our organizations who touch economic development in the community. So that's something the EIC had talked about in the past, but didn't advance at any point, so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Apologize for,
No, that's okay, that was not on the agenda in a specific manner.
Mr. Chair, can I get a qualification or just information on, clarification on our time factor, or what are we looking at here?
Yeah, Commissioners, the sheriff's debate is tonight at 5:30, and they're anticipating a large crowd, so with the.
Is that here?
It's in this room.
Okay, so we've had something on the agenda, I just want to make sure that, since number 2, we postponed that at the last minute because you're waiting for someone?
we're waiting for Kent to join us.
And Kent
Yeah.
isn't here yet.
We can proceed now.
Could we start with the presentation so that we can get that discussion
Yes.
out of the way and not leave it?
And I will, when we proceed to closed session, we'll get Kent on the phone.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
So we'll go back to item number 2 and we'll come back to 3E later.
Yes.
Okay. All right, item number 2, then we'll go back to the dairy project overview. I believe Steve's going to give us an overview, up to date, and then we'll adjourn to a closed meeting.
Okay.
Okay, so this is kind of an overview of the dairy site and what we're going to be talking about shortly. So the dairy site is addressed as 301 View Street. That is the primary access point right now. The dairy site includes 29.5 acres of land. The original, we kept talking about 28 point something, but the area where the siding came into the site is actually a title issue, and I believe Kent will confirm the fact that it belongs to the property. Otter Tail River frontage is 3,460 lineal square feet. The yellow indicates the scope of the dairy site. When you look at it in relationship to the city, it's a significant piece of property. The green line that runs north and south is Union Avenue. Adjacent to the yellow property on the west is Barefoot Park. That does not have access to it from the road, at least not safe access. You can hobble across the tracks to it, but if the dairy site is acquired, it would have access via the dairy site. This is the dairy site. You can see that little siding piece that comes in there, and that should not be shown as a separate parcel. It's actually part of the whole piece. This is Barefoot Park, adjacent to the dairy site on the west. This is some pictures of the dairy building. There's the northeast corner of it. That's the west side of it. That's the foundation remaining from the wash area. You can see Hillcrest across the river. This is a view taken across the roof of the buildings. I believe there were two original buildings that were built in 1940. There's 20-some additions that were made to it. That's the river that you're looking at, and in the distance you can see, I believe, City Hall. This is another view of the roof area. You can see that wash pit again and Hillcrest Academy across the river. This is looking towards the neighborhood that's on the north side of the track, adjacent to the property. This is looking west, so the site begins or is framed on the north side by the railroad, and then on the south side by the river. It runs from Broadway to Barefoot Park. This was the master plan that shows the old Archie's site. It also shows a piece of property owned by Paul Tisver, who owns Quality Toyota. And on the south side of the tracks, it's showing, envisioning utilizing that site. That road that comes through is coming in on Broadway. Likely the entrance would be moved over to Buse as opposed to Broadway because of the width of the property and width of the access at that point. This plan envisions including Barefoot Park with it in order to cross the track. There are two parcels that are currently owned by the city, whereby the road would turn into those and then up St. Andrews. This site you saw last time, this is showing the part of the property that would be encumbered by LCCMR. That's in green. It's 11.2 acres. The red portion of it is approximately 18.3 acres, which would be retained for future development. That's the end of the slideshow. I don't really have any other things to convey other than to say the concept is to have the Port Authority acquire the site, clean up the site, demolish the buildings, sell the green area, the LCCMR encumbered area, to the city for an appraised value, assumed to be $1 million. That would be equal to what the current work in progress value would be for the site. When that was done, or concurrently, the LCCMR money of $600,000 would be available to the city to help pay that $1 million purchase price. Balance of the property would be held until the appropriate time to sell it for redevelopment. I guess I'll say a couple of things about grant money. One would envision that the trail system and buffers would be completed at approximately the same time that the demolition and site cleanup occurs, which is anticipated to be winter 2019, spring 2020. There is another grant that I believe the city has applied for to pay for the construction of the trail itself, and that would be available in 2020 if the whatever the entity is providing it approves it.
Greater Minnesota Parks and Trails.
Greater Minnesota Parks and Trails. I have no other things to say about the property. There are some title issues, there's some pollution that we've talked about many times, but that ends up being part of the negotiation issues. So are there any questions?
With that then, due to time, I think if the committee is okay with it, we'll adjourn to a closed meeting to discuss real estate negotiations regarding the dairy property pursuant to Minnesota State's Section 13D.5 subsection 3C. The Port Authority may reconvene to an open session for consideration for purchase agreement for the dairy property. Okay.
Do you have battery?
You have to
Grab the back door here.
Close the door.
the purchase agreement for the dairy property. Go ahead.
We should read it first.
Yeah, I would move that we move forward with the recommendation as presented by Mr. Erickson, with the addition of continuing the discussion on the crossings, and that would include slope study and RAP. That would be my resolution, and then we instruct, subject to approval by Mr. Erickson and our attorney, that we move forward and instruct the staff to move forward to finish that agreement by the end of the year, or to close it.
We have a second.
Is that clear, that motion?
See, I have one more thing.
There is a motion.
Yeah. I'll second it.
Yeah,
Okay.
let's just make sure that's on there.
Can
Yeah.
I add my thing now?
Yes, you may.
The purchase agreement has a contingency that needs to be dealt with by the 31st. I would remove the contingency also.
Okay. So I accept that. Do you accept that?
Yes.
Okay.
Go ahead,
We need to
Scott.
have the proposal made of it. We know what it is, but nobody else does, so we need to have what the proposal is and what we're gonna pay and all that stuff, because nobody else knows about it right now. So somebody read it up to us. I mean,
Yes, as Steve.
the original, yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
right. He put it away. That's something Ken can maybe do.
Can't you do that from, you're just talking about the amount, right, and the,
Somebody want my notes or?
No, you go ahead.
You can read it off, Steve.
Well, some of these, here's my recommendation. Accept a purchase price of $175,000, that the city deal with the title corrections, and that the closing not occur before the title is corrected, and/or the city agrees to escrow, or the buyer and seller agree to escrow the funds until the closing is, until the title objections are completed. That they accept the railroad lease, that the city accept the Otter Tail Power encroachment, city obtain a non-association letter from the MPCA and DNR prior to closing. City complete the property appraisal, currently as a work-in-progress form.
Steve, can I stop you for 1 second? I just want to clarify, we're talking about the Port Authority, not the city.
Yes, sorry.
Just so everybody is
Yeah.
on the same
Yeah,
page.
sorry.
thank you.
Want me to reread this? with-
No.
Right.
But everything he said applies to the Port Authority,
Right.
not
Other
the
than the
city.
appraisal that he
Right.
said.
Well,
That is
yeah.
the city. The appraisal's the city, yeah.
Right, it should be, except that it should be copied both with the port and the city, because the port will use it for its purposes and the city for another purpose. Anyway, providing a copy of the appraisal to Cheney. Close the transaction as soon as possible after receipt of a non-association letter. I guess I don't, there's a current provision in the purchase agreement allowing Mr. Cheney to seek relief from the Dairy Association. I'm saying leave that in there. Waive the due diligence contingencies, which terminate on July 31st. Revise section 7 to include the non-association letter. Delete section 7.7. That has to do with either party can get out of the purchase agreement. And the statement that the purchaser has assigned its interest to the Fergus Falls Port Authority. Kent, do you have any additions?
I don't, other than just to clarify that the closing would be conditioned on the contingencies identified. It wouldn't remove them all. It would just be contingent on addressing those contingencies that have been identified as opposed to what's presently in the agreement.
Yeah, and those are defined in there, so that's just a change.
Then the only other modification would be Mr. Speedall's point about the continued due diligence on the railroad crossings for future use. Thanks for clarifying that. So do we have a motion on that update?
We have the resolution.
We lost Kent.
Now we have discussion.
Okay. Now we can have discussion, I guess.
Okay, I'll start. I won't be voting for this. We don't have the monies.
Kent?
We don't have the plan for the monies.
Okay, sorry, we lost you.
I just think that it's too much of a hurry situation right now. We gotta do this tonight or we don't do it. I think this can be put off until we make a plan for the scenarios of how much it's gonna cost taxpayer down the road if it does come to that. How we get the $175,000 to pay for it. I just don't believe that we should move on this tonight. I mean, I'll vote no on this for them factors. I think the dairy property needs to be cleaned up. I think we can do it, but we're not ready for it yet. So we're not ready, our plan is not in place financially. We've done everything but the financial part of it, I believe.
Thanks, Scott. Anybody else have any comments before we take a vote? Hearing none, then I'll call for the question. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Is that for,
Roll call.
We'll call it.
Just to
Go
firm.
ahead and do the roll call.
Okay.
we'll do a roll call?
I voted not. I'll just, Justin, I voted no, Jill, and I think Brent voted no.
That motion carries. We will reconvene up to our item number 3E, report on inquiries received to date on Port Authority properties.
Commissioner, just real quickly, reminder of the debate tonight at 5:30, and I was just informed while we were in closed session that they have to rearrange some things in the room, so if the topic can wait, I would suggest doing that. If not, I would recommend that we keep it real short out of respect for the people that are coming this evening for the debate.
Our next agenda.
Yeah.
I mean,
Put it
we got
on.
plenty of
Wait,
time.
yeah.
I suggest we set that next meeting date if we could.
Yeah.
Just get some additional items.
You can set a next meeting date.
Yeah, we can do it via email.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, that works best.
okay.
So we still have the issue on the preparing for the non-association letter. We've got basically 120 days to do that. We either need to approve that process to start without having a budget for it. We have an estimated budget from Ron, but I would think you would want their detailed list of what they're going to do. So would you call another special meeting in order to do that?
Call our next meeting at the next regular.
I think we
meeting.
can take care of that our next.
But by the end of August or the third week,
Yeah.
it's too late.
Oh,
No, I had,
no, we could, well, yes,
Oh.
we'll call a meeting.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
I would, part of the motion, as I understood it, was the approval of your condition, as you read, and that the attorney and you would finalize those agreements, and we direct the staff then to follow through to make that happen. I had mentioned at the end of the resolution that the staff would follow through. Now, I understand that to be a staff follow-through issue, not a separate issue, because the purchase is the larger issue. So I don't understand if we need another meeting. It seems extra, like you're adding on something that's already been decided.
I think what he's
And
referring,
so I asked the attorney for that clarification. It sounds like we've already made the decision and directed staff to carry it forward.
Yeah, I mean, the action you took tonight, basically, my opinion is that you've instructed your director to sign an amended purchase agreement consistent with what was presented. If there's other documents that need to be signed in connection with that, I don't see that as being excluded from what you've been given the instruction.
I think the question is, though, that this would require an additional $12,500 expenditure. And I don't know, in the $30,000 slope study, and I don't know that the motion that I heard would give us the broad authority to go out and
I did
spend
mention the slope study in the resolution. I included that. I said
You
the
didn't-
slope
no money
study
amounts were
and the
talked
other.
about, though.
So,
well, I think due to time unless, I mean, I think we'd be looking to have something, a meeting early August. We'll try and
I don't
coordinate
think we can
something.
have-
Yeah, that would suffice to deal with it. Then you've got a scope of services of what's going to be done and what the costs are associated.
Gives staff time to,
I think
Yeah.
just get Ron to update them.
Yeah.
yeah,
fair enough.
yeah.
Anything else to come before us in late business? If not, we'll adjourn. Thank you.